Hey world history, I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you had a good Easter break. I went out fishing a lot and I caught some good stuff and I enjoyed every bit of it. We're going to be moving on in our chapter on the Protestant Reformation this week. Oh, I started the wrong slide. Let me go back. There we go. Sorry about that. We've talked about Wycliffe and Hughes. We talked about Martin Luther, and we talked about how really Luther was the one who challenged the Catholic Church with the 95 Theses, and how his ideas are now starting to actually gain some steam. So what we're going to talk about this week is how the ideas continue to move forward. We're going to analyze some primary sources this week. You'll find them on Google Classroom. I want you to do some readings from Luther and Calvin to answer some questions. That'll be the bulk of what you do. We're also going to trace very briefly the spread of Protestantism. Once Luther started the whole deal, we're going to look at how it spread to others, particularly the Anabaptists. We're going to talk about the Eucharist, or communion, which we all probably did for Easter, I'm assuming on Sunday, but the bread and the wine or grape juice. We're going to talk about what beliefs lie behind that, and then we're going to analyze the very basics of John Calvin's theology. I told you guys to read chapter 12 by today, which is the chapter we're studying, and if you did, awesome, you're good. If you haven't, then really try to get that done this week, so it'll help you with all things we're going to do this week. I can tell if you haven't read or watched the lectures, by the way, pretty easily. If you go on and try to do a Google search for something for the discussion, you'll get marked, because I don't want to just get random facts. We're emphasizing things as a class together when we talk about, for example, John Calvin, or talking about the Anabaptists. So you need to watch the lectures and do the readings if you want to score A's on the assignments. Okay, like I said, you're going to be analyzing some primary sources, and you guys remember from our very first class, a primary source is higher, better than a secondary source. For example, if you're going to study George Washington, reading his actual journals, his speeches, that's a primary source about George Washington. If I were to write a biography about him and you read my book, that's a secondary source. You want to always, and it's okay to use secondary sources by all means, but you need to really stick with the primary sources. If anybody in here decides to major in history, then this is all you're going to talk about. They want you to constantly focus on the primary sources, and for good reason. Otherwise, you get these really sloppy books that are just factually inaccurate because they don't really know how to study, the actual important data. So you want to know how to look at the primary sources and use those, and we're going to be doing that this week. Okay, the second point, trace the spread of Protestantism from Luther to the Anabaptists. So again, we talked about Martin Luther. He really started this whole thing, and people were influenced by him and continued to run with what he had started. Ulrich Zwingli was a Swiss leader, and then there were a few small differences, but for the most part they agreed. But to keep things simple, we're just going to focus on the difference that continued to keep them torn apart, sadly. Now, we're going to be talking about this in a future slide, but the Roman Catholic Church had a particular view of communion, and Martin Luther departed from that view. And what happened was Zwingli also departed from the Catholic view, but he also departed from Luther's view. And basically, whereas Martin Luther believed that the actual substance of Jesus Christ is present in and with the wine and the bread, Zwingli believed that when you take communion, it's completely symbolic. So when you eat bread, you eat wine, there's nothing special about the bread and the wine. Rather, it's something that God brings back memories, maybe it helps you reflect on Jesus' death, but it's not like you're actually eating anything special. You're not eating the body and blood of Jesus or anything like that. And whereas Martin Luther believed you were eating the bread and the wine, but you're also taking in the substance, the stuff of Jesus. And that one disagreement caused them to continue to fight and to be at odds with each other. I'm curious to see what your church believes about communion, but we're going to get to that in a little bit. But that's the basics of Zwingli. Zwingli was a leader who was like Luther, and he's Swiss, but the big thing they differed on was communion. Okay, moving on. You have what's called the Radical Reformation that emerges also. And the or sometimes people call it the fourth strand of the Reformation. But the Anabaptists, these were people who emerged and they said, we like you, Luther and Zwingli, but you guys aren't taking your ideas far enough. And the thing that they were really known for was opposing infant baptism. Up to this point, everybody in Christianity, they baptized infants. So in other words, when you were a baby, you'd be baptized in water, and then that was it. And that was their way of baptizing you into the church early on. Anabaptists, and the Greek word for ana means again or re, so rebaptizers. These are the people that believed that you should not be baptized until you're old enough to make a choice for yourself. And so they didn't like the idea of being called rebaptizers because they didn't even believe the first baptism was valid, right? They said it's only valid when you're old enough to make your own choice. So they began practicing that. They got pushback from Luther, from Zwingli, from Calvin, from basically all the other Protestants hated the idea. And obviously the Catholics hated it too, which is funny because Anabaptists, their views are pretty much the dominant views in America today. But at this time, they were the radicals who believed that you should wait till you're old enough to be baptized. But besides the baptism, they also had some other ideas that were interesting for the time. They didn't believe in fighting in wars. They were what you call pacifists, so they believed do not participate in any wars and just keep things in your church and live kind of a separate lifestyle from the world. They wouldn't even allow you to be a member of the church until you were an official Christian who covenanted with the other people after you were baptized and after you made a covenant with everybody to live according to certain ways. So all these ideas were pretty radical because back in the Catholic and the Calvinist churches, they believed that you needed to be baptized as an infant and you were part of the church. Now you could leave one day, but as far as they were concerned, you were part of the church as soon as you were born into it. But the Anabaptists said you're not part of the church until you're old enough to make a choice to be baptized and to consent to the covenant of living in the church. So only true believers. And if you look at the Mennonites and the Amish today, these are actually pretty consistent offshoots, as I should say, from the Anabaptists. They continue to live much in the same way. The Amish, in particular, if you see a horse-drawn buggy, they're out here in Missouri or up in Iowa and other places, they continue to live that separate lifestyle. They don't use a lot of the electricity and a lot of the modern technological advancements that we use. They continue to live a very simple lifestyle, and they exercise their own justice for the most part. And yeah, they're very strong in these beliefs. I should mention, like I said earlier, they were hated by everybody, by the Catholics and even by other Protestants. And this is sad, but what they would do is if they captured an Anabaptist, then they would drown them as punishment. And they called this the third baptism. That was what they called the punishment. Because again, they'd been baptized as an infant, usually, and then they would get baptized again when they were older. Well, then the other Protestants or the Catholics would drown them, and as punishment, calling this the third baptism. This picture is a very famous picture right here, and it's actually, I think it's kind of moving. It's very sad, but these people over here, including him drowning in the ice, they were chasing this Anabaptist. And as the Anabaptist was running, this pursuer fell into the ice and was drowning. So the Anabaptist turned around and grabbed him and saved his life. But then they all gathered around the Anabaptist and captured him and killed him. So he actually ended up, by coming back to save the person that was attacking him, he ended up losing his life because they all continued to catch him and execute him, basically. Okay, moving on. John Calvin, and I know that you guys have probably heard his name before, and we've probably mentioned him several times, but John Calvin was a leading reformer, and he's known for emphasizing the sovereignty of God, and which we're going to see in a second. He wrote a famous systematic text theology book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, and that's something that's practiced to this day, that's followed by a lot of people. He led the city of Geneva, and we don't have time to go into that whole thing, but it's a fascinating story. But they basically put him in charge of everything. He emphasized a doctrine known as predestination. So God basically chooses from the very beginning who's going to be saved and who's not going to be saved, who's going to go to hell and who's going to go to heaven. And he also emphasized real presence, or you could call this spiritual presence too, but the idea that Christ is spiritually present in the communion elements of bread and wine. So on that note, we'll come back to Calvin's theology, but I want to take a quick break and look at the views of the Eucharist here, because there are quite a few of them. The Roman Catholic Church taught that the bread and the wine literally become the body and blood of Jesus Christ, like literally, even though it tastes and looks like bread and wine, that the actual substance is changed into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And this is called transubstantiation. We don't have time to go really deep into it, but basically, they go back to Aristotle's ideas of primary and secondary substance, or substance and accident, rather, and it's all based on that philosophical framework that they make this case. Martin Luther thought that was silly, and he departed from them, and he created a theory that we typically call consubstantiation, but a lot of Lutherans don't like that title, but whatever. Con means with, and what that means basically is that the substance of Jesus Christ is present with the bread and the wine. So you're eating bread and wine, and you're also consuming Jesus, but there's nothing changing about the bread and the wine. There's things being added to the bread and the wine. The Calvinistic view, is what John Calvin taught, is that Jesus is spiritually present in the bread and the wine. He's spiritually there, but he's not physically. Nothing's happening to the bread and wine, but there's a spiritual element that's added to the whole thing. My church, the Church of the Nazarene, Methodist churches, we believe with Calvin on that too. So it's not just you're a Calvinist, like you're Presbyterian. A lot of Baptist churches will hold to those Calvinistic ideas. The Anabaptists, and this is what we just talked about, they believed in what's called a symbolic communion, meaning that the bread and the wine represent the body and blood of Jesus Christ, but there's nothing special about the bread and the wine at all. It's just bread and wine. But when you eat it, maybe it gives you a time to reflect, and maybe you can have a subjective experience in the process, but God is not doing anything special in a spiritual or a physical way to the actual elements of communion. And when the discussion, I want you guys to tell me, what do you believe, and what does your church believe? How often do you do communion? What do you believe about it? I'd be interested to hear what you guys believe. I'm assuming most of you are in the Anabaptist camp, but I would like to hear what you have to say about it. Okay, and then moving back to John Calvin now, his theology. So again, like we said, the sovereignty of God is John Calvin's primary emphasis. God is in charge. God knows what's up, and God makes all things happen. And the thing that Calvin's probably the most famous for is his soteriology. Soteriology is a famous word that basically means the study of salvation. Soteria in Greek is saved or salvation, and the study of. So basically, your soteriology is your personal belief on what salvation is and how one can be saved. John Calvin's view can be summed up pretty easily in what's called tulip theology, T-U-L-I-P. And basically, this is what Calvinism states in a nutshell. Human beings are 100, total depravity is the T. Human beings are 100% evil, totally wicked by themselves. If God didn't do anything to help, we would just be 100% evil, wicked people. The U is unconditional election, that God's elect, those people that are going to go to heaven, have been chosen by God, and it's not based on any conditions. There's nothing you did to be chosen by God. God chose you for whatever reason from the beginning of time. L is limited atonement. Jesus didn't die for the sins of the world. He only died for the sins of the elect, for those people that are going to be saved. Jesus didn't die for the people that are damned to hell. I is irresistible grace. And basically, if God has chosen you, you can't say no. If God has chosen you to be part of his elect, if you're part of his elect, then you can't say no to being saved. You will inevitably say yes. And the P is perseverance of the saints, which is just a fancy way of saying you can't lose your salvation. If you're somebody who's a Christian, if you've said the sinner's prayer and you're in, then you will persevere to the end. You will not turn away if you're truly part of the elect. So to some, tulip theology in a nutshell, the point is that you are chosen by God or you're not chosen by God. If you're chosen by God, you're going to be drawn in and you're going to say yes to God and be a Christian. If you're not chosen by God, there's nothing you can do. You're screwed. You're going to go to hell. I mean, that's what it is. That's Calvinism in a nutshell. And if you're going to be technical, it's called double predestination. The idea that God has predestined some for salvation, some for damnation. Double predestination. Now, an opponent to John Calvin is called Jacobus Arminius. And Arminius, he's not even in the textbook, but I want you to know this. Arminius was a guy who challenged Calvin and said, no, God gives everybody a choice. Everybody has the ability to choose. And Arminius was taught by, I think, Calvin's son-in-law. I need to double check that. I think Calvin's son-in-law. And he was a Calvinist in a sense. He operated in the same categories. But Arminius believed that every human being, even though we're depraved, God gives us the grace to make a choice, to receive him or to reject him. And the God's elect refers not just to a group of people that God chose for whatever reason, but God's elect is the group of saved people that God chose based on his foreknowledge that these people would choose him in the first place. So to Calvin, God just chooses a group of people to be saved and that's it. But for Arminius, God chose a group of people to be saved, right? But that group of people's being the elect is based on the fact that God knew they would choose him already. So in other words, we all have free will and everybody can choose to become a Christian or not. And in the end, with Arminius, you can turn away. You can lose your salvation if you want. It doesn't mean that one day you sin too many times and your salvation's gone. That's not what it means. It means that somebody who's truly a Christian, who's following after Christ, can turn his back on Christ and leave and give up his salvation. So that's the belief of Arminius. So Calvinism versus Arminianism is a really hotly contested debate. And maybe we can talk about that too soon, about what your church believes on that. Okay, so I'm trying to keep it brief just because I want to focus more on the primary sources. But this week, just make sure you watch the lecture, which you just did. Congratulations. There's a discussion this week, but I'm not going to require replies. It's just going to be state your opinion. That's all you need to do. And it's going to be on the Eucharist. I want you to spend most of the time this week reading excerpts from Luther's Freedom of a Christian and Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. I have a very small section from both of those. I want you to read and answer questions. Watch CNN 10 every day and leave one comment. That's all I need to do this week. I hope that made sense. And if you have any questions, let me know. But we'll continue on with the Church of England next week and the Counter-Reformation. Love you guys. Have a good one.